Did the war just cross an invisible line that Moscow believed still existed? In the early hours of a cold December night, towering flames erupted from deep inside Russia's Rostov region, sending a column of black smoke into the winter sky, and instantly reframing assumptions about what parts of this war were truly rear areas. For viewers watching grainy phone footage spread across social media, the scene looked less like an isolated strike and more like a warning flare. The Novoshakhtinsk oil refinery was burning, and with it burned the illusion that distance alone could guarantee safety. Here is the question that immediately followed for audiences across Europe and beyond. If a critical refinery, hundreds of kilometers from Ukrainian-controlled territory, can be hit so precisely, what else is now within reach? According to Ukrainian military statements, British-made Storm Shadow cruise missiles were used in the strike, marking a notable escalation in both capability and intent. This was not another improvised drone attack aimed at disruption. This was a deliberate deep strike against infrastructure that underpins Russia's war economy. Almost simultaneously, reports emerged of explosions near the Kanskaya airfield, close to Maykop in the North Caucasus, reinforcing the sense that the operation was coordinated, multi-targeted, and strategic in design. The timing matters. Over the past year, Ukraine has steadily expanded its campaign against Russian energy infrastructure, targeting refineries, depots, and export nodes that feed both military logistics and state revenue. But this night stood apart because of the weapon involved. Storm Shadow is not designed for harassment. It is designed to penetrate hardened targets, evade layered air defenses, and turn high-value facilities into long-term repair projects. In military terms, this signaled a shift from attrition to paralysis. Novoshakhtinsk is not just another refinery on a long list. It is the only major refinery in the Rostov region, a logistical artery for Russia's southern military districts. Its output feeds diesel for armored units, fuel for transport columns, and aviation products essential to sustained operations. Damaging such a site does not merely interrupt production for a day or two. It ripples through supply chains, rail schedules, and operational planning. For a war already straining Russia's industrial base, even temporary outages compound existing pressure. From a NATO perspective, the strike underscored something Western analysts have been saying quietly for months. Ukraine is no longer limited to tactical defense. With Western-supplied long-range systems, Kyiv can now shape the battlefield far beyond the front lines. That capability forces Moscow to divert air defenses inward, stretching already finite resources. Every missile battery repositioned to protect refineries is one less covering troops or logistics hubs closer to Ukraine. The political signal was equally clear. Under a U.S. administration led by President Donald Trump, Western support remains calibrated but consequential. Storm Shadow strikes demonstrate that advanced weapons, when used selectively, can produce strategic effects without indiscriminate escalation. This balance is closely watched in Washington, London, and Brussels, where the debate is no longer about whether Ukraine can strike deep, but how often and how sustainably it can do so. As dawn broke over Rostov and emergency crews battled refinery fires, a larger question lingered in military headquarters on both sides. If this was only the opening move, what target would come next? And how prepared was Russia to stop it? Why was Novoshakhtinsk chosen over dozens of other industrial sites scattered across southern Russia? The answer lies not just in flames or symbolism, but in cold logistics math. As emergency crews worked through the night, analysts began mapping what this refinery actually represents inside Russia's war machine. Novoshakhtinsk is not a marginal facility. It is a tightly integrated node in a regional fuel network that supports both civilian consumption and military operations moving toward Ukraine's southern and eastern fronts. Here is the question that quickly surfaced among defense watchers. Was this strike aimed more at fuel tanks or at Russia's ability to move and fight weeks from now? Designed to process roughly 7.5 million tons of crude annually, the refinery produces diesel, aviation fuel, marine fuel, and other refined products essential to modern mechanized warfare. Its rail connections and pipeline links allow fuel to be distributed rapidly across the Rostov region and beyond. In peacetime, that integration is efficient. In wartime, it becomes a vulnerability. Ukraine has already demonstrated throughout the year that repeated targeted disruptions can force refineries into cycles of shutdowns, inspections, and partial restarts that steadily degrade output. Storm Shadow's involvement elevated that pressure dramatically. Unlike drones, which often damage surface structures, this cruise missile is designed to penetrate and detonate inside hardened facilities. That matters because refinery damage is rarely about visible flames alone. Heat exchangers cracking units control rooms, and safety systems can take weeks or months to repair, especially under sanctions that complicate spare parts procurement. Every day offline is a day of lost fuel that cannot be easily replaced elsewhere. Western energy analysts have pointed out that Russia's refining sector has already been operating under strain. Capacity losses across multiple facilities have forced internal rerouting of fuel supplies, raising transport costs and complicating export commitments. For Moscow, this is not just a military problem, but a fiscal one. Oil and refined products remain central to state revenue. Interruptions reduce cash flow strain budgets and limit flexibility in sustaining a long war. From NATO's strategic viewpoint, Novochakhtinsk fits a pattern. Ukraine is attacking what keeps Russian forces mobile, rather than engaging them head-on everywhere. This approach aligns with Western military doctrine, emphasizing logistics as a center of gravity. As one retired NATO logistics planner noted in recent commentary, "You don't need to stop every tank if you can stop the fuel that feeds 10 of them." The refinery strike illustrated that logic in real time. The location also amplifies psychological impact. Rostov is not a distant frontier settlement. It is a major administrative and transport hub. Flames there resonate far beyond the blast radius, reinforcing a narrative that the war's costs are creeping inward. That perception matters politically, particularly as Russian authorities seek to reassure domestic audiences that control remains intact. Yet, the refinery fire may only be the visible portion of a deeper effect. Repair timelines, insurance assessments, safety inspections, and workforce disruptions all accumulate quietly after cameras leave. These hidden delays are precisely what Ukraine's planners appear to be targeting. As smoke drifted over Novochakhtinsk, a new uncertainty settled over Russia's fuel network. If one key artery can be cut this cleanly, how many others are now exposed? If the refinery strike targeted Russia's fuel lifeline, the hit near Kanskaya airfield delivered a different message entirely. No runway is automatically safe anymore. Reports from residents near Maykop described a low, unfamiliar roar, followed by heavy concussions, a sound profile consistent with a cruise missile, rather than the buzzing drones Russians have grown used to. Ukrainian officials later stated that the airfield had been struck and set ablaze, reinforcing the impression that this was not an isolated event, but part of a coordinated deep strike operation. The immediate question for military observers was unsettling. If an airbase roughly 500 kilometers from Ukrainian positions can be reached, what does rear area even mean now? Kanskaya has long been described as a training facility home to aviation units responsible for preparing pilots, rather than launching frontline combat missions. In theory, such bases sit lower on any strike priority list. In practice, modern wars erase that distinction. Training airfields store fuel, host rotating aircraft, support logistics flows, and free up frontline bases by absorbing overflow activity. In Russia's current wartime posture, every operational runway in the south has value. From a strategic standpoint, striking Kanskaya forces Russia into a costly dilemma. Either resources are diverted to protect facilities once considered safe, or Moscow accepts the risk of repeated disruption. Air defense systems are finite. Moving them deeper into the interior means thinning coverage elsewhere, particularly closer to the front, where Ukrainian drones and missiles already exert pressure. NATO analysts have long argued that forcing an adversary to defend everything is often more effective than destroying any single target outright. The distance involved also carries symbolic weight. 500 kilometers is not a marginal extension of reach. It fundamentally reshapes the operational map. Storm Shadow and its French counterpart Scalp compress geography. What once required long bomber flights or risky forward basing can now be achieved with adapted strike aircraft releasing missiles from well outside dense air defense zones. For Russia's Air Force planners, This introduces persistent uncertainty. Aircraft dispersal hardens shelters, and constant alerts become necessities rather than contingencies. Economically, the implications are less visible, but just as serious. Even limited damage to an airfield triggers inspections, flight suspensions, and safety reviews. Training schedules slip, maintenance cycles stretch, fuel consumption patterns change. These disruptions ripple outward, affecting readiness over weeks rather than days. In a prolonged war, cumulative inefficiency becomes a strategic liability. From the Western perspective, the strike reinforced the argument that Ukraine is using advanced weapons in a focused, military-oriented manner. There was no attempt to mask responsibility or blur the target set. The message to NATO partners was implicit long-range capabilities are being applied to degrade operational capacity, not to provoke indiscriminate escalation. That distinction remains central to ongoing debates in Washington and European capitals, under a Trump administration carefully balancing deterrence and restraint. As daylight revealed damage near Kanskaya, Russian commanders faced an uncomfortable realization. Protecting the front now also means defending the deep rear, and doing both simultaneously may be impossible. If one training airfield can be touched, which operational base will feel the pressure next? How did these missiles get through systems? Russia has spent years building and advertising as layered and resilient. The answer lies not in speed, but in geometry. Storm Shadow was never meant to outrun air defenses. It was designed to confuse them, slip between them, and arrive from angles defenders would rather not think about. That design philosophy was fully on display during this strike. The question many viewers asked after the first videos surfaced was simple, but revealing. If Russia knew these missiles existed, why did they still get through? Storm Shadow is subsonic, but survivability is its strength. Flying low and hugging terrain, it uses the landscape itself as cover. Hills, river valleys, and infrastructure clutter distort radar returns, creating blind spots even for modern systems. Guidance combines inertial navigation with satellite updates, but the critical feature comes at the end. In the terminal phase, the missile uses imaging infrared guidance to match what it sees to stored reference imagery. Jamming GPS does not make the missile blind. It still knows what the target is supposed to look like. Then, there is the warhead. Designed specifically for hardened infrastructure, the two-stage penetration system punches through external structures before detonating internally. This is why damage assessments often lag behind the dramatic footage. Fires are visible, but the real destruction is structural and systemic. Control rooms, reinforced compartments, and internal pipelines are far harder to repair than scorched rooftops. Russia does intercept some incoming weapons. That fact matters. No defense is perfect, but no offense needs perfection either. Military planners work on probabilities. If enough missiles leak through often enough, the defender is forced into constant adaptation. More radars, more batteries, more crews on high alert. All of it costs money, manpower, and time. NATO air defense specialists frequently describe this dynamic as defensive exhaustion, where the burden gradually shifts to the side, trying to protect everything at once. The geography of southern Russia compounds the problem. Coastal plains, river networks, and rolling terrain create natural corridors that low-flying missiles can exploit. Covering these gaps continuously requires dense sensor coverage and rapid reaction forces, a demanding task even for well-funded militaries. Stretch that requirement across thousands of kilometers and vulnerabilities inevitably emerge. From a Western military perspective, the strike validated long-standing assumptions about modern air warfare. Precision weapons paired with detailed planning can defeat numerically superior defenses by forcing them to react rather than predict. For Ukraine, this represents a form of asymmetric leverage. It does not need air superiority everywhere. It needs just enough access, just often enough to impose cost. Politically, this technical success feeds back into strategic debates within NATO. Under President Trump, skepticism about open-ended commitments remains strong, but effectiveness matters. Demonstrated results make continued support easier to justify. A missile that forces Russia to redeploy defenses and absorb economic damage strengthens the argument that quality, not quantity, can shift the balance. As analysts dissected radar coverage maps and flight profiles, one conclusion stood out. The strike was not a lucky break. It was the product of deliberate planning and a system designed for exactly this kind of mission. And that raises the next question. If this method worked once, how often can it be repeated before the defense finally cracks? Was this a dramatic one-night escalation or evidence of something far more methodical? As analysts compared timelines, the answer became increasingly clear. The refinery and airfield strikes were not isolated acts, but part of a sustained campaign aimed at weakening Russia's war economy from the inside. In the days surrounding the Storm Shadow operation, multiple reports pointed to Ukrainian long-range drones hitting fuel storage facilities, ports, and energy nodes across southern and central Russia. The pattern was unmistakable. The question for observers quickly shifted: is Ukraine now fighting a logistics war rather than a battlefield war? Western reporting over recent months has consistently highlighted the cumulative strain on Russia's energy sector. Repeated attacks on refineries, depots, and export infrastructure have forced shutdowns, emergency repairs, and rerouting of supply chains. Each individual strike may appear manageable. Together they form a grinding pressure that compounds over time. Fuel shortages do not need to be absolute to be decisive. Delays, inefficiencies, and uncertainty are often enough to degrade operational tempo. From an economic perspective, the implications extend beyond military logistics. Oil and refined products remain central to Russia's state revenue. Disruptions reduce export volumes, complicate contractual obligations, and increase insurance and transport costs. Western economists tracking sanctions enforcement have noted that infrastructure instability amplifies the impact of financial restrictions, tightening the margin within which Moscow can maneuver. Every refinery outage narrows options. For NATO strategists, this approach is familiar. Modern Western doctrine emphasizes attacking systems rather than individual units. Energy networks, transport hubs, and maintenance facilities form the backbone of sustained warfare. By targeting these nodes, Ukraine is applying pressure where Russia is least flexible. Unlike frontline units, industrial infrastructure cannot be rapidly regenerated or rotated out of harm's way. The Storm Shadow strikes add a new layer to this campaign. Drones can harass and disrupt, but cruise missiles threaten permanence. They force defenders to consider worst-case scenarios rather than tolerable losses. That psychological shift matters. Russian regional authorities may downplay damage publicly, but internally, planning assumptions change. More resources flow to protection. More contingency plans are written. More time is spent reacting rather than projecting power. From the US and European standpoint, the campaign also tests escalation boundaries. Under President Trump, Washington has emphasized burden sharing and measurable outcomes. Ukraine's energy-focused strategy provides both. It degrades Russian capability without mass civilian casualties and aligns with Western expectations of proportionality. That alignment is critical to sustaining political support. Looking ahead, analysts expect this pressure to intensify rather than fade. As long as Ukraine retains access to long-range systems and adapts its tactics, energy and logistics targets will remain in focus. Repairs may restore function temporarily, but repetition erodes resilience. As the campaign unfolds, a sobering realization takes hold in Moscow's planning circles. The battlefield is no longer confined to trenches and front lines. It runs through refineries, rail yards, and power nodes. And the question looming now is not whether Ukraine will strike again, but which part of Russia's energy network will be forced to absorb the next blow. What does this all amount to when the smoke clears and the headlines fade? Beyond the immediate damage, the Storm Shadow strikes mark a shift in how this war is being fought and understood. Ukraine is no longer merely responding to pressure at the front. It is shaping Russia's strategic environment by forcing hard choices far from the battlefield. This is where military effect, economic impact, and political signaling converge. The question that now confronts NATO planners and Russian commanders alike is stark. Can Russia defend its war economy everywhere at once? Every refinery damaged, every airfield disrupted imposes a long-term tax on Russia's ability to sustain operations. Repairs require skilled labor, imported components, safety inspections, and time resources that are already under strain. Even when facilities return to partial operation, output often remains below capacity for weeks. Multiply that across multiple sites and the cumulative drag becomes significant. This is how wars are lost quietly through attrition that never makes dramatic footage. For NATO and the United States under President Donald Trump, the strikes underscore a strategic lesson. Precision restraint and targeting discipline matter. Ukraine's use of long-range missiles against clearly military and economic targets strengthens the case that Western-supplied weapons can produce strategic results without uncontrolled escalation. This matters politically in Washington and European capitals, where public support hinges on effectiveness and accountability. There is also a narrative dimension. Fires in Rostov and explosions near Mykop challenge the idea that the war's costs are distant or abstract. They force Russian authorities to explain why interior regions require missile alerts and emergency responses. History suggests that sustained pressure on economic infrastructure shapes domestic perceptions over time, even in tightly controlled information environments. Yet nothing here guarantees a decisive outcome. Russia will adapt. Air defenses will shift. Repair crews will work around the clock. Retaliatory strikes will continue against Ukrainian infrastructure. This remains a grinding contest of endurance. What has changed is the geometry of risk. Distance no longer provides insulation, and the rear can no longer be assumed secure. As this phase unfolds, the decisive factor may not be any single strike, but repetition. Can Ukraine maintain this tempo? Can Western support sustain it? And can Russia absorb the costs faster than they accumulate? Those answers will define the next chapter of this war. Ukraine's storm shadow strikes on the Novoshakhtinsk refinery, and Kanskaya airfield signaled a strategic evolution in the war. These were not symbolic attacks but carefully planned operations targeting the logistical and economic foundations of Russia's military power. By striking fuel production and aviation infrastructure deep inside Russian territory, Ukraine demonstrated its ability to compress distance-impose economic cost and force Moscow to defend far more than the front line. The broader impact extends beyond visible damage. Energy disruptions strain military logistics and state revenue, while airfield strikes complicate readiness and force defensive redeployments. For NATO and the United States under President Donald Trump, the message is clear: limited numbers of advanced weapons used precisely can generate outsized strategic effects. This reinforces arguments for sustained but measured support. Looking ahead, the conflict appears set to deepen into a battle of endurance. Russia will adapt, but adaptation itself carries cost. Ukraine's challenge will be maintaining pressure long enough for those costs to accumulate faster than repairs and countermeasures. So here is the question for you: if the rear is no longer safe, how does this change the balance of the war, and how far can Ukraine push this strategy before the next escalation line is tested? If you found this analysis valuable, consider subscribing to the channel for continued in-depth coverage and strategic breakdowns of the war's next phase.